lovely people. Welcome to another book chat, the regular but not monthly roundup of what I've been reading recently.
Sophie Vlogs.
I have 8 books to talk about this week. I think I'm going to start with fiction because there's quite a lot of non-fiction in this one, so I will start with my fiction, end on some non-fiction. So, first up is Dear Mrs. Bird by A.J. Pearce. I read this book because my work has a book swap shelf, so you put books on it that you are happy for people to take home and read, and then we do a big swap. And this is the first one from the shelf I've read, and I actually really enjoyed this. This was a really lovely read. It's set during World War II in London. Our main character, Emmeline, really wants to be a war correspondent, and then due to a slight mix-up, instead of starting a new job as a war correspondent, she's actually working for a ladies' magazine answering letters. But as the novel progresses, Emmeline is very touched by all these letters that she's receiving, but because the editress of the women's paper has very strict rules on what is and is not appropriate to answer in a magazine, there's all these women who she feels like should be helped but aren't being helped, and she starts to try and find a way to do so. I went into this expecting like a light romp, and it very much was that. It has a very quite amusing writing style. It's very easy to read. It's quite like light and funny at the beginning, but as it goes on, it does get more serious, and there were quite a few moments in this which were like quite touching, and I think it was a nice way of exploring what living in the Blitz is like, what being a woman who wants to go into journalism during that time is like, whilst also being still quite light-hearted with like a lot of heart to it. So this was a thoroughly enjoyable read, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars because it was quite fun. A book which I did not enjoy as much is The Eight by Katherine Neville. This is, the basic set of this is that there's like this chess set which belonged to Charlemagne, and it was given to this abbey for safekeeping, and then during the French Revolution, because a lot of abbeys were disbanded and stuff during that time, the abbess decides to split up this chess set and spread it across the world. So we have 2 narratives running throughout. There's one narrative which is set during the 1700s, which follows 2 girls who were at this abbey and their role in taking the pieces of the chess set away from the abbey. And then we have our second plotline, which follows Katherine in the 1970s, who is somehow getting embroiled in the continued chase to try and find this chess set. It's compared to Dan Brown on the cover, and I definitely see that. To me, it felt quite Kate Moss in some ways, but just like not as good. Essentially, this had... The writing style of this felt a bit clunky at times. I know a lot of people, when this came out, absolutely adored it and thought it was amazing. For me, there were a lot of moments of very clunky foreshadowing. There were just moments where she would just go like, little did I know how important that conversation would be later. And you're just like, very heavy-handed foreshadowing that is, you know, you're just like, I get it, something bad's gonna happen. Great. And also, one of the main problems I had was this felt like she was trying to ram in as many notable people as was possible, and a lot of the time I didn't see the point of it. We had essentially like anyone who was anyone during the French Revolution is in this. Catherine the Great, Bach, Wordsworth, William Blake. It was just all of these, just Napoleon, just like anyone who was a notable figure at this vague time period has somehow been managed to be weaved into this, but they're not characterized very well. It's not like these are, because you know, sometimes you can have these narratives where you weave real life famous people into them and it works really well, and the way that that person was is a key aspect of the plot. A lot of this felt like name dropping. They didn't feel like very different people. None of this characterization of these famous people was like, oh yes, that's Napoleon, but like, it was just like, here is a person who has a famous name who is like, just here, and I don't know, like, I just felt like the main characters were not always that likable to me. I found some of their decisions, like, the woman in the 70s plotline does a lot of like, oh, I don't know anything about chess, and then she'll come out with this stuff and she'll be like, even I know blah 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 blah, and I'll be like, well, you do know stuff about chess then, don't you? You're not a fool. I don't know. So like, I can see how, to some people, this is a wonderful exploration of things like chess and maths and music and combining all of these things and it being very interesting and tense and stuff like that. It just really didn't work for me. I feel like I've read books like this that were done so much better that to me this just felt a bit sloppy. So there's that. Moving on to some middle grade children's literature. I read Cogheart by Peter Bunzl. This was quite a fun middle grade read. It's very steampunk. There are like airships and clockwork people and animals. They're sort of created, and there's a whole realm of like, are these clockwork people like, are they sentient? Are they real people, or are they just servants and stuff like that? Essentially, Lily's father goes missing, and he has invented this clockwork thing which a lot of people want to get their hands on, so Lily's life is in danger. She teams up with this boy Robert, who is a clockmaker's son, and also this fox that her father made, and then they go about trying to figure out what's happened to her father. It's very, there was a lot of the plot of this which I could see coming, but I still enjoyed experiencing it. It's one of those, because, you know, it's aimed at children, so if you're reading this as like an adult, you can see the plot hints and where stuff is going to go, but there are some lovely ideas in this. There's some really interesting discussions to do with like sentiency of these clockwork beings and like the rights of these clockwork beings and stuff like that, which was an interesting aspect involved. I can see how this has been set up to be the first book of the series. I do have book 3, but not book 2, so that's going to be interesting. But suffice to say, if you're looking for like a fun, like middle grade romp with some interesting like steampunky, not steampunky, but like clockworky aspects, stuff like that, this was thoroughly enjoyable, and I enjoyed it enough to want to see where it's going to go next. So yes, it was quite sweet. Okay, my final fiction is A Quiet Kind of Thunder by Sara Bernard. Steffi doesn't talk, she has selective mutism. Reese is deaf. They meet at school because she's the only other person in the school that he's transferred to who uses sign language, BSL, even if she is a bit rusty. And then it's sort of like a YA, it follows them. They end up getting into a relationship. That's not really a spoiler, it happens quite early on. So it's like Steffi navigating this relationship with Reese, navigating her friendship with her best friend that is also going through some stuff. And this was fun. This was very sweet. I really enjoyed throughout this BSL is sort of put throughout. So like you've got the letters in the front and then there's numbers in the back, and each chapter number shows the BSL how you sign that number, which was really interesting. This was a really enjoyable YA book. I got a bit annoyed towards the end because characters made decisions which I thought were stupid, but also the way that adults reacted to those decisions also boggled my brain, because regardless of whether or not you're proud of X or Y thing, it was still there was some decisions made which could have not been made. But on the whole, I don't read a lot of like YA romancy type things, and this was a particularly cute and sweet one, so I did enjoy this. Okay, we're now going to bring it home with 3 non-fiction books. Starting with Last Words, Letters and Statements of the Leaders Executed After the Rising at Easter 1916. The Easter Rising is a very famous moment in Irish history. I found out about this book whilst doing a tour of Kilmainham Jail in Dublin, which was very, very interesting, and that was a very worthwhile activity to do on holiday. It was one of the highlights of visiting Dublin, actually. And one of our guide talked about this book because it's a collection of as it says on the tin, you know, the letters and writings of all of the people who were involved, who were held in Kilmainham Jail. It was very interesting. The names who are featured in this are names which I'm familiar with from having read about the Easter Rising. It was very interesting, this as a way of getting a better sense of them as individuals rather than figures involved in a famous moment in history, but to see like the priorities, the voices, the tones of these people as individuals. So like some of them were concerned with like the legacy. They were like, here are my writings, could you get this published, blah blah blah. Others were concerned with like paying off debts. They owed people debts, could you pay off these debts? And then there were a lot of the most touching moments are obviously letters to loved ones, to wives and children and parents and siblings that they know that they're not going to see again because they know what's going to happen to them. Most of the people featured in here were executed, so these are their final goodbyes and stuff like that. So it's very touching, and just like they're touching, but they're touching in different ways depending on who you're reading about. So I really enjoyed this. It was quite a quick read because it's quite short, but at the same time was something that involved taking a lot of time with, because these are people's last letters and stuff. So it is, I don't know, it feels important to spend enough time reading what they're saying. But no, so this was very interesting. I'm glad I've read it because it sort of helped me individualize the people a bit more, rather than them just being like involved tactically, like these people were in this building during the Rising and these people were in this building. It's like actually like this is a bit more what they were like as individuals and people. So that was really good. I really enjoyed. Enjoyed might not be the right word, but that was a very valuable read. After that is The Basque History of the World by Mike Kurlansky. This was so interesting. I didn't know anything about the Basque people until I read this. The Basque region is a region that is like, it spans between Spain and France. So there's like French Basque region and Spanish Basque region, but obviously that is a more modern development. Previously it was just the Basque region. The language of the Basque language is like completely unique. It doesn't have the same like roots as the other languages surrounding it and stuff, which is very interesting. Essentially, I came to realize how much I didn't know about specifically Spanish history reading this. So the Basque people, in that way that happens a lot of the time when you are like a minority group within a larger like country that forms, so like Breton in France and like Welsh and Cornish and Irish and Scottish, and that, you know, like these smaller pieces of what becomes a larger unified whole. And then sometimes the persecution that comes with that, and the difficulties and stuff. So that was very interesting to see, especially in like Franco regime and stuff, the treatment that Basque people experienced and all that thing. It was very interesting. It was not something I knew anything about. Sometimes I had a small niggle with this narrative whereby we would, for example, be in the middle of a chapter that was looking deep into like the politics during the Franco regime and World War II and that sort of thing, which was really, really interesting. And then we would have a whole chapter just about eels, because the Basque people eat a lot of eels and the different way they prepared eels. And then we would go back and pick up the politics chapter again. So I gather that he is a guy who his other book is called Cod, and it's a history of cod. So like, I gather that food is a thing that is this guy's specialty. And there were moments when food being interweaved in this were really interesting, because, for example, with salt cod and the Basque like industry associated therewith, that was quite a political thing. It had like during sieges and stuff. There's all these historical moments that it can tie into, which was cool. It's just every now and then he would like break up the narrative and throw in a recipe or something, and I'd just be like, could we have a chapter that is recipes and then carry on with our like political plotline? But it wasn't too jarring. It was just every now and then I was like, oh, eels. But on the whole, it was very interesting, very educational, very informative. Didn't know any of it. Very glad I read it. The final book I'm going to talk about in this book chat is The Grammar of Ornament, a visual reference of form and colour in architecture and the decorative arts by Owen Jones. This was very interesting. Essentially, this is like it's like a visual compendium guide, essentially. So like, this was created during the Victorian times. It was hugely influential on like the arts and crafts movement. People like William Morris, stuff like that, like used this a lot as a resource. It's essentially like split into different, so there's like a Greek chapter, there's like Islamic art, there's Indian art, there's it goes across the world. It's different arts, and a lot of the time it's visual references, lots of examples of that art and patterns and stuff. But then it starts off with a small introduction, and Owen Jones talks about like his opinions on that, on like what you can learn from that particular culture's art and architecture style, and like in what in his opinion is good about it and what is bad about it and stuff like that. As a visual reference guide to artists, I can imagine this is immensely helpful. It mentions a couple of times in annotations, varying people who were big in like the architecture world, who would like trace designs of this as they were learning to do architecture, which makes so much sense. From a text point of view, occasionally I had niggles because this is very Victorian in its outlook. So, for example, the Greeks were the pinnacle of learning and the peak of all, creative goodness, and then it has like Polynesian art, it has like art from New Zealand and stuff like that, and there's sort of like the noble savage sort of outlook on it, whereby these people are able to create beautiful art because they don't have the intelligence to overthink it, which is a bit iffy. And then, for example, not a big fan of Chinese art, doesn't think that that's very good. So there is a lot of worth to be taken from this. I think it would have been immensely helpful both at its time and now for artists, absolutely. Some of the opinions in this I think we could critique quite rightly. But on the whole, it was an interesting read. I'm really glad I read it. Yes. Okay, I feel like this has been a bit of a mammoth book chat. That's everything I wanted to talk about. As per usual, have you read any of these books? Do you have opinions on any of these books? I would love to hear them. If you have any recommendations, the usual, give me a chat in the comments below. Otherwise, I hope you're having a really lovely week, and I will see you next time for something different.